Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Annalisa Hultberg, Extension Educator in Food Safety at University of Minnesota. And I think a lot of you have been on the series of webinars, Produce Safety Deep Dives. We're looking at different topics related to good agricultural practices and kind of taking a deeper look. So this morning we have Phil Tocco with us from Michigan State University. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself quick?
Sure. I am housed in Jackson County, which is in the south central part of the state, but I cover the entire state with respect to on-farm produce safety. I've been doing it full time since I was since 2010 and been doing on and off food safety since 2009, I think officially 2009, but it's been my exclusive sort of way my exclusive purview since 2011.
Thanks, Phil. And Ariel, you want to introduce yourself quick?
Hi everyone, my name's Ariel Pressman. I was a longtime organic vegetable farmer in Wisconsin, and right now I work with Annalisa at Extension to help farmers out with wholesale readiness, post-harvest handling, and food safety work.
And Lauren, you want to say hi?
Hi, I'm Lauren Backus. I'm just here for tech support. So
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, do you want to launch the pre-poll, Lauren? So we have a quick poll. You can answer those if you wouldn't mind. There's a gray bar on the right to scroll down if you haven't answered one of these with multiple questions. All right, I think we can end this. And might as well share the results. Quite a few people interested in selling wholesale. Kind of a range of readiness. Good. People feeling confident about their understanding of gaps and water, more or less, and they've taken trainings. So excellent. Thank you. All right, I'm going to just have a few slides here to kind of set the stage. As we have questions as you go, if you could put them in the Q&A, that would be great. You can also raise your hand and Lauren will unmute you with any questions. Ariel will be kind of looking at the Q&A, and this is meant to be sort of informal, even though we're in a webinar format. So just go ahead and ask questions as they arise for you. So we're going to do this deep dive into wells, water testing, well design, knowing that a lot of growers in Minnesota do use wells. Now, this is kind of not always the case. In other states, they might be relying much more heavily on surface water, for example. So wells in general tend to be pretty safe as sources of agricultural water, but they are not completely immune to issues. So we're going to bring up some of those issues, how to reduce them, and just how to kind of understand this important piece of infrastructure on your farm. Just to let you know, we are here to help. We have offerings beyond this that we could help you with. There are 2 more of these left. We have next time is excluding wildlife and fencing. Very important to us, especially as deer populations continue to grow, and then writing our farm's food safety plan. Again, good agricultural practices are just kind of those set of practices that we use on our farm to minimize, reduce the risk of microbial contamination. Thinking about our water source is one of these good agricultural practices, and a pretty important one, because if we are applying water that has contamination on it, it can have a potential to have a pretty big impact, because if we're spraying it via overhead on all of our crops in the field, it can spread contamination that way. If we're using it in post-harvest and there's contamination in it, it's going to be able to spread around those contaminants readily. And there's a very historic and nice looking well to get us thinking about wells. So that's it. Lauren, do you want to go ahead and launch the pre-poll? So now we just have 3 questions about your use of water. Okay, yeah, I think that gives us a good understanding. You can end it and share it. Majority on well, not surprising. All over in terms of testing. And most are not covered by the rule. Thanks, Lauren. All right, Phil.
All right, so I am gonna go ahead and get myself set up here. Okay, so oh, there we are. All right, so we're gonna talk a little bit about wells today. Um, in general, we're going to hopefully get you to a point where you can identify well key components and then get a good assessment of how groundwater can get fouled, and hopefully you'll walk away being able to locate a water lab near you. I really want this to be interactive, so folks, please don't hesitate to speak up, put your hand up, put something in chat, stop me, do whatever you need to do to really get my attention and make me make me stop. And if something doesn't make sense, absolutely let me know what's going on, or let me know what your question is. Um, One of the key things right out of the chute, it sounds really counterintuitive. I sit before you as a non-expert of wells. I didn't get a hydrogeology degree. I've never installed wells. I've learned everything I have from watching people, and watching myself fail. So that means that basically the information I received or that I have is because, I've gotten to a place where I needed some information and have had to lean on people to get better information. So again, we all have bits of information together. Every one of you in the audience has probably a bit of information about wells. And when we work together, we share the information that we have. That's really when the magic happens, because that's why people come together to do these, to learn. We think we're looking for one person to tell us how to do things, and in reality the true magic is really in bringing everyone together and having us all talk about and share our experiences around a particular topic. That's how we truly learn from one another, and recognizing that we all have a piece of the puzzle. So I want you guys to feel, like I say, I want you to feel engaged enough and empowered enough that you can unmute or put something in chat. I will definitely listen. So, um, just to give you a sort of a sense of what wells are typically, the basic design, all wells need three things. One is a source of power, another is a pump to draw water, and then the last thing is a method to regulate flow. There are a lot of additional things that go on that improve the a well's production capacity and improve its functioning. Things like air bladders, backflow preventers, and concrete pads are all ways that you can add to a basic well to get to a point where it functions better. But ultimately, all you need are a source of power, a pump to draw water, and a method to regulate flow. Now, if we were looking back at Annalisa's well design, if you think about a well like that, that's just basically essentially a wishing well, a well-maintained wishing well, the source of power is us, right? And then the pump to draw water is actually, or the method to draw water is the bucket. And then that method to regulate flow is getting the crank to go up and bring up the bucket. So those are the three things that are absolutely necessary for a well. Now, there were some additions to that. Can anyone tell me what some of the additions you saw in that wishing well? Oh, I see a chat. What's a chat? Roof. Exactly, Jackie. Yes, there was a roof. And that roof helped to protect it. And it was really in some respects a food safety sort of addition, because then birds that are flying overhead don't don't poop right in the well. And it gives the creatures, if you will, that could potentially get to that well some minor barrier to getting into the well. The stone wall, okay, Annalisa, the stone wall around the outside, that helped to protect water from potentially getting into the well and fouling it. One thing that may not have been terribly evident is if you looked at that well, if you looked at it, it had a wooden, almost like a wooden uh, uh, top on it. It basically was covering. It was covered underneath the roof. There was a piece of wood that covered the entire opening. The idea there is then that keeps bugs out. That keeps a lot of it could keep mice and rats out. And obviously, if you have a mouse or a rat that falls in and dies in your well, that's gonna cause a pretty significant could potentially cause a problem. So yeah, those are some things to think about. Now, okay, so we have three basic types of wells. The dug well is that well that Annalisa showed. It tends to be a shallow well. It's not a very deep well. Usually, you have to have a high water table to get down to water. There is, in fact, even with all of those precautions, even with a roof and that stone wall and a cover on it, there's a pretty high risk of contamination for a number of reasons that we'll discuss a little bit later. So this idea that I mean the well is good for a lot of uses, but again, it's still a pretty high risk of contamination. Driven wells are another one. You'll see this in a lot of sandy areas. You'll see this in places that are close to the lakes that have a lot of sand and also have a fairly shallow water or high water table. It's a shallow well again up to 30 feet, and literally the a point is driven into the sand down into the water table. It's often used for irrigation because it's very quick to install, relatively speaking. It's cheap to install. I bought myself a Sandpoint well. I as a demo device, I think I spent $50 on it. I would need another, maybe 20 feet in stainless pipe that would attach to it, and then a driver of some kind or other to drive it into the ground to where it would hit water. So the idea is it's not like you're not spending many thousands of dollars to put the well in. It pumps a reasonable amount of water, but what it pumps is largely water that is from a surface water source that's been drawn through the column of soil and particulate that it sets in. So they are also called Sandpoint wells. And because of the fact that they're drawing a lot of surface water in general, there is a pretty high risk of contamination there. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about how wells get fouled here as we move along. The gold standard, what most people are using if they are if they have a home well or if they've got wells out in the country, are drilled wells. Typically, these are very deep. They usually go down at least 50 feet, usually deeper than that. The deeper they are, the safer they are generally. It's basically they dig down until they reach the bedrock, and they dig down just a little bit deeper than the bedrock when they hit water. And then they sink a casing right down so that it sets on the bedrock, and then the well itself draws from the rock underneath, the fissures in the rock. Typically, then they take that casing and they pump a mixture of bentonite, which is a clay, and it's a clay that swells, and then they mix it with a little bit of sand and a little bit of concrete so that it forms this watertight seal. And because there's bentonite in there, that clay is unusual in that when it gets water, it swells. And if it's dry, it shrinks. And they put it in dry so that it stays there. And then if water gets around into that, it'll swell up and tighten around the well casing. So it's a nice way to ensure that there's a nice tight seal there. So that's kind of how those are set up. Again, we talked through the water well or the wishing well example with Annalisa, but you see the same things that work here at a well that like is a hand pump well. The source of power is the person doing the pumping. The pump to draw water is the plunger at the bottom that does this up and down motion that draws the water up into the column, and then the method to regulate flow is the actual like stopping and starting the pumping. So that kind of thing is true across the board. Now we're going to talk about the pump a little bit more, and we're going to talk a little bit about other things that you might see. So there's three basic pump designs that you're likely to see in the Midwest when it comes to wells that are drilled wells. You could see a jet pump, an impeller pump, or a submersible pump. Now, I use these three sort of general designs because you're going to see this sort of layout of like a half circle setting on its side with some piping coming out and going into the ground, or you're going to see the half circle sitting above the well hole, or you're going to see like a big round cylinder sitting on the ground. All three of these is how I'm sort of representing them in a very graphical icon sort of way. We're going to talk a little bit about more of each of these now. The jet pump, this is the actual jet pump, or an actual jet pump in the wild, if you will. They typically use something called the Venturi effect. They pull water out of the ground and they push it. So basically, as the pump works, it just basically uses the differences in diameter pipes to really draw water out of the ground. It is one of the most powerful types of pumps. So if, for instance, you have a really deep well, you're probably going to use a jet pump to pull it out. If you have a shallower well, other pumps might be more appropriate. Impeller pumps, this is an impeller pump that you see there. The pump is on the surface, so the motor is on the surface, but the thing that draws the water up, if you were to follow underneath that sort of the semicircular thing on top, or the ovoid thing on top, there's essentially a rod that extends down to the base of the well, and that turns an impeller that drives the water up out of the ground. It can generate higher volumes, but it's not as effective for deeper wells. So typically, 65, 100 feet. And it's hard for me to give a generalization, because anytime I come up with a generalization, usually somebody says they found an exception to the rule. So as much as I say they can generate higher volumes, in some cases, they may not be able to generate the volume you need. And it may be that they have a deep well that runs an impeller pump. So the issue, there's a couple of big issues with impeller pumps, in the sense that the deeper they are, you can imagine if you've got a really long rod and there's a little vibration up top, because we're dealing with something that could essentially act like a lever, a little vibration up top could cause big issues down below. So that's why an impeller pump may not always be the best choice, because that rod that drives the impeller at the base of the well is long. And again, if you aren't perfectly stable up top, just a little bit of vibration on top could mess up that rod pretty quickly. So the last one is a submersible pump. If you've got a sump pump, like a dry well or a sump in your basement, the pump that's used in your sump pump is a submersible pump. It is built to live underwater. And so typically the pump itself is below the water line, and it's used for lower volume withdrawal, like in a house situation. So typically anybody that has significant acreage or needs significant water, they usually, if they've got a submersible pump, if they've got a home well, they'll likely also use a cistern they'll use the home well to fill the cistern, so they can have adequate amounts of water, adequate volumes of water when they need it. So you'll see that typically with submersible systems. Again, these can be very deep. These can be 100, 200 feet deep. It really doesn't necessarily matter. They can do pretty well. So other parts you might see, and this is where we start to get into things like backflow preventers. Oh, We've got a chat question. I want to make sure I don't lose anybody. Phil, would you say that the drilling company will generally indicate what type of pump to use? I would say yes. Most of the time you're not going to have to worry about that. It'll be something that they'll say, yeah, you need a X pump, or they might be privy to using a particular kind of pump. So they'll set it up in a way that makes sense. So yes. So the first thing I did want to show people, a sandpoint well, and I'm betting you've got a little bit of interference from this. So I'm going to go down to a much smaller thing there. So let's go back to that. The sandpoint well is right there. So what you can see there is it's a long rod. And one of the things that you'll see if we were closer, it looks like it's perforated because it is perforated. Oh, hang on. Okay, sorry. So the sandpoint well, if you notice at the you've got that point, that blue thing, that is the point that drives into the point that drives into the sand, and you'll notice that the diameter of that is a little bit larger than the pipe itself. And they do that on purpose to give just a little bit of space for that to pass. Hang on. Okay. So basically, you would attach stainless steel pipe. There's a threading on the opposite side of the blue point. Hang on. Okay. Sorry. Someone is desperately trying to reach me and I'm not sure why. So, and on the other side, you'll see the threading. You'll see the blue point on one side and the threading on the other. So the idea is you would continue to add stainless steel pipe to that threaded end until you get till you're driving it down into water, or once you hit water. And then you drive it a little bit further and that would be enough. Those perforations allow the water in the water table to move into the pipe, and then you draw it out using a pump. And that's kind of how that works.
Phil, how
Okay.
long are those generally? That looks really short sitting on a table.
It is really short. The actual part that draws the water, or the part that sits underneath in the water table, is pretty short. It's only about, I would say, 4 foot long. And then the rest of it is basically you adding stainless steel pipe and then driving that pipe down into the ground over and over again until you hit water. So it is really, that part itself is not very long. For comparison, I really should have, we had a picture of a sandpoint well with the pipe attached, and some person is holding it. I really should have brought it because it looks like they're holding this great big javelin, and that's kind of how it looks when it's got additional piping attached to it. So another thing that you might run into is something called a pressure relief valve. And this is a pressure relief valve. One key thing that you need to notice for most of the well components, you're going to see an arrow. So if you look at the right side of this, you'll see basically what looks to be an inlet and an outlet on the left and right sides. On the right side of it, on your right, there should be a little arrow on the inlet. That denotes how the water should flow through the device. So, and you'll see this a lot in backflow preventers. We'll get to this. You look for the arrow for a clue as to what it's supposed to do. In this case, that little black cap that's on there, when the system reaches a point of pressure that is too much for the system, that cap pops up and allows water out. So the system then can bring itself back down, bring the pressure back down. So it's it's something that many people keep in line, especially if they need a certain amount of pressure, but not too much pressure in the system. Good example is if you're using drip irrigation, sometimes you need pressure reliefs or pressure regulators in the system to maintain a certain level of flow in a given area. So like you might have one system, if you're using drip tape that's and you want to know that you're giving 10 gallons per minute, it may only be 10 gallons per minute at 10 psi. So putting that pressure regulator in there will keep the system at 10 psi and no greater. Because you could probably pump enough water in there to really drive that up. And then what you get is blown out drip tape and other things like that. So it helps to make everything work right. So another thing is a swing gate valve. Now you'll notice some pictures here that show the actual that show the arrow on that, the direction of flow. But there's some other interesting factors around this, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so you guys can see. I have the swing gate valve here. This is going to be interesting to see if I can make this work. But what also it says is there's the problem with the swing gate valve is it swings like this, and if it's oriented in a wrong direction, you'll notice how it just flops around like that. It never closes. So not only does it have a direction of flow arrow, but it also has an orientation. So it'll say this side up on it. And that gives it to a point where then if it's sitting like this, let me see if I can make this work. If it's sitting like this, you can see it clumps down. But if it's sitting like this, it doesn't clump. Or if it's like this, you'll see it kind of droops around like that. So if I had it in this direction, it wouldn't work as a backflow preventer because the water, instead of stopping up here, would go right through, continue to go right through. So that's why that works. That's why, it has an orientation as well as a direction. The reason why someone would pick one thing over another has a lot to do with cost. In some cases, a swing gate valve may be less expensive than another valve that works a different way. So we're going to go back to sharing again. Okay, so the next valve that we're going to talk about is a spring swing valve. This is just like a gate valve, but unlike the spring gate valve or the swing gate valve, this one has a spring that knocks that gate back into place. So it's a more robust way of approaching it. As soon as the pressure drops, it closes, and then you've got backflow prevented. A ball valve is another one. This is a ball valve. I'm going to show you, again, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so you can kind of see the ball valve. So the thing about a ball valve, there's a ball in there, and you can get to the ball. Typically, you can check this. The top unscrews, and so basically, as you unscrew it, you can take off the top and check the ball inside, and the ball will literally pop out. So when it is fully extended, the ball will be like this, and that will allow the water through. As soon as the pressure drops, that ball clamps back down and prevents the water from going back into the ground. And you'll see in a second why that's so very, very important to have a check valve of some kind in your system to keep the water from going back into the well. So we're going to go back and share again. Here. Okay. So then we've got a reduced pressure zone valve. Now this valve is typically only used for municipal systems and commercial, like large scale commercial applications for water. This is what I would consider overkill for agriculture. So if folks are trying to sell you this as a backflow prevention device in your system, it is not appropriate for agricultural uses. This RPZ, what it is, each one of those little things with what looks to be a plug on it on top, the black plugs on top, each one of those is a check valve. So it creates an area between two check valves of reduced pressure. So it keeps it from it's sort of a fail safe. It's sort of, if one check valve fails, you've got two or three more to keep things in line. So it's a really careful way of, or an extra extra insurance to make sure it works right. Typically, they start at about $300 and go up from there. Most check valves, you can probably get a simple check valve for like $10. So if you're paying more than $10, it's, 10 or 20, you can probably find an adequate check valve. And in some cases, you can get one that screws right on to your hose so that when you're at the end of your hose or at the beginning of your hose, so that way it automatically shuts off and doesn't allow the water to go back into the well. In some cases, particularly with respect to the jet pumps, there's a special valve that sets at the base of the well called a foot valve. It sets at the foot of the well. And the idea here is it shuts off the water at the very bottom. So if there's no backflow in water, if you've got a pump that's pumping out and all of a sudden it stops and there's a change in pressure, that foot valve shuts, and that keeps all of the water in the water column so that the pump doesn't need to be reprimed every time it turns on. So it maintains the pump prime and keeps things running. So the next time you turn on the pump, it can immediately start dispensing water. So it helps to sort of keep things rolling. Typically, if there is a foot valve or any valve that's in line underneath the ground, you will know it's going bad because the line won't be able to maintain pump prime. So it'll be kicking on regularly to keep pressure or to keep everything in line. In general, groundwater can get contaminated a couple of different ways. The first is through the cross connection. So we talked about backflow prevention. If there's no backflow prevention, then you get a situation where there could be contamination from up above. I'm going to demonstrate this in a second for you because I think it's important for you to understand all of the different components. So the other way is it could flow down the casing. So remember, a well is basically like a straw that goes down into the groundwater. So that straw, if your casing is imperfect, or if your casing starts to break down, or that sanitary seal breaks down, then you can have a situation where water can pool around the outside of the well, and that can get into the water. That's why when Annalisa mentioned that stone wall around that wishing well, that was to prevent pooling water from getting into the well. Now, other things that can happen over time, feces and other contaminants can flow down into the water column through the dirt and then get moved as water gets moved through the soil into the groundwater. So that's a potentiality. Typically, most of the time, water and contaminants move very slowly through the soil. So it's matters of tens or hundreds of years before you get any kind of contaminants, unless there's a high water table, in which case there could potentially be some contaminants that slowly perk into the water table that you're drawing. The last way is if there is a surface water contaminant, it could potentially move through the soil into the well and into the water that you're drawing from the ground. So, like for instance, those sandpoint wells, if you can hit water at 5 feet or at 10 feet, that's a situation where if there's a surface water source close by, it could potentially get in there and cause some problems. Now, let me kind of demonstrate these a little bit so you can kind of get an idea of how this works. So a well is basically a straw that goes down into the ground to meet water. Okay. So backflow prevention, I have myself a little bit of green dye, and I'm going to do some things that are kind of gross. I'm going to put a little bit of this on my tongue. Now, I have green dye in my mouth. Okay. So if I don't have a backflow preventer, what happens? You see the green? I now have fouled my well. So in that situation, there's a potential to foul my well just because there's stuff in the line. So that's why we have a backflow preventer, is so that there's no backflow. You think your 2-year-old, this is why you don't share your drink with your 2-year-old, because you never know when that 2-year-old is going to backwash into your drink. So think every time you think about a backflow preventer, I want you to think about your 2-year-old drinking your Coke and why you don't let your 2-year-old drink your Coke. Okay, now. So that's one way your well can get fouled. Now I've got a second way. So poop doesn't move into surface water by itself. Okay. So if we have poop on the surface, and we're going to go back to the St. Patty's Day colors. If we have poop on the surface, let's say our green dye is poop on the surface, and I don't know that you can see this, but I got green dye there on the surface. It needs water to move into the well. It needs some way to be motivated to go into the well. So in this case, if water pools around the surface of the well, then all of a sudden it goes down into the water. So do y'all see the, oh, crud. Now so you can kind of see that there. I've made a huge mess of my computer in trying to make this work. So that's the second way. So you saw the two ways. Turn off blur so we can see. All right. Okay. Then you get to see. Okay. So you can see that it's blue, it's green, and I'm getting more on my computer. But the idea here is the fact that it's over top. My computer is never going to be the same. Okay, real quick. I should have kept some stuff. All right. If I cut out, you'll know that I had some issues with my computer getting too wet. It's going to be green inside. The people that are the people that are it was worth it. Thanks. So okay, back to the original presentation. So now that we've gone through that, it's talking about, we need to talk about the rest of the story, if you will. Okay, so there are a couple components of, I'm going to really talk specifically around a consumer well, because I think it's important to talk about the different components, because you're most likely to have a submerged well or a house well. And so that's why we'll talk about that in particular. So one of the key components of a submerged well is the well cap. And there's different ways of doing a well cap. There's different styles of well cap, but in general, they all basically have a rubber expansion gasket of one way or another. And the idea with that is, as you screw the cap in place, it will expand the rubber gasket, and that will create an airtight, watertight seal. And it's sometimes referred as a sanitary seal. You may also find a screened vent, because what happens is when you pull water out of the ground, if you have an airtight seal, you're pulling water out of the ground, you're basically removing something from the ground, and there's still a vacuum. Water doesn't just come out and air doesn't just miraculously pour into that space. You need to have a way to push air into that space, or a way to get air into that space that allows for that free pull of water without creating a vacuum. So typically there's an air vent that will allow water, or allow air to get into that space and fill that space that you just took water from. So if there's a problem, if you've got backflow preventers and you've got a system that's theoretically contained and those backflow preventers fail, if you turn it off, you're actually going to hear a whoosh of air out the screened vent, because the water will go back and it'll displace the air that got pushed into that area. So that's another indication that you potentially could have backflow preventers failing. So it's another thing to think about. But looking for that rubber expansion gasket is really important. So the typical, there's a commercial type of well cap that has a gasket that sets on top when it's screwed in place. And in this case, the one pictured actually has two metal plates with the gasket in between. And those bolts, as you tighten those bolts, they squeeze the plates together. And as they squeeze the plates together, that's what pushes that expansion gasket out, creating that airtight seal. So that's those are two flavors of home wells that are out there that you can kind of look for those things. The next one is a well casing. So in this case, when you look at that, you see that PVC pipe, that 4-inch PVC pipe. It can be made out of PVC. It can also be made out of stainless steel or carbon steel. It can also be solid or perforated. In some cases, you're going to have a casing that goes down into the water table. And in the area where it is in the water table, that casing really needs to be perforated so that it can allow the water in to get pumped up. But the perforation level is actually usually in the bearing layer. You don't usually get perforation above the bearing layer. In some situations where there could be saltwater pockets, you definitely do not want to have perforation in those areas where there's saltwater pockets. Even in the Midwest, where we have an abundance of fresh water, we also have situations where there are pockets of salt water. So we don't want saltwater intrusion, obviously, when it comes to not only agricultural wells, but food wells in general or home wells in general. So we try to avoid that. And then the other thing is the sanitary seal. We talked a little bit about the fact that that's made up of bentonite and cement and sand. And they also call it an annular seal, and states have usually a minimum depth of seal that they require all wells to meet. In general, you want to make sure that this is in good condition. Some people actually put a cement pad on top of their annular seal. Like I said, that bentonite swells, and when it swells, if there's concrete above it, if there's no place for that increased swelling to go, it's going to break the concrete pad. It takes a long time before there's enough water in bentonite to make it swell enough to break concrete. And you would still have enough time, if that concrete breaks, for you to check to make sure that there isn't a problem happening with your well. So it's usually an early warning device to put a cement pad on top of your well and on top of that annular seal. It gives it an added level of protection from actually water getting into it, but it also allows an early warning when it breaks, when it busts. Likely what's happening is at some point along the annular seal, there's some water getting in there that's making the bentonite swell, that's breaking that concrete pad. So that gives you an early, that's when you need to call the well guy and say, I'm thinking my annular seal breaks down. And so when you have a good annular seal and there's ponding around the base of the well, that ponding doesn't get down into the wellhead. When there's no good annular seal, or when there's a breakdown in that annular seal, you have the situation like the green food coloring that was ponding around the outside. It goes right down. It literally follows the straw essentially to your water source. So it's important to make sure you have a good solid annular seal on there. So another thing you might see in a water system is piping tanks. I alluded to the fact that commercial wells may not have a significant volume or flow rate to accommodate what some uses on the farm are needed. So the piping tanks allow you as a grower to be able to essentially stockpile or run your pump throughout the day to get all the water you need, so that when you need it at once, you've got it all at once. So you can often see piping tanks like this, but it also can relate to pressure tanks. Sometimes you'll see a blue tank that looks like a propane tank. It's called a bladder tank. It's there to maintain pressure in the system, so that, again, once you turn it on, it's kind of like maintaining pump prime. We maintain pump prime so that when we turn the knob, water will come out, but it doesn't always come out at pressure. So that bladder tank holds a certain amount of water to maintain pressure in the system. So you've got your pump, prime that maintains the flow, but then you've got this bladder tank that has a little bit more that keeps the pressure high so that when you turn the handle, it doesn't dribble out. It comes out at the pressure you expect every time. So that's kind of a thing. These piping tanks can be open or closed, and it's important to think about the potential risk of that's associated with an open cistern versus a closed cistern. So think about how critters can get in there, or if critters can get in there, and then work to minimize the potential risk associated with that. And then the last bit is treatment equipment. This can be like an injector, a filter, or other method. These you'll see them set up as a bypass system. In this case, you've got that dosatron underneath. So you see the U area, if you follow the PVC pipe, it's got a U set up with right in the middle's got the dosatron, and that is hooked up to a I think it's sanitizer or fertilizer that pumps into the system. And you'll also notice that there's two red knobs on either side. And the thing about the red knobs that's the way you control inflows and outflows. So if those were vertical, like the top one is going with the pipe, then it would allow flow through. But if they're horizontal like that, it means that the water is not going to be pumped through that and picking up whatever's being dosed into the line. You want to evaluate this for backflow prevention before the bypass, because if you don't have backflow prevention, then you get backwash in your system, just like I showed you with my mouth. So you don't want that. So when it comes to choosing a lab, the only way you can really determine whether or not your well is actually having a problem is by having a test. And MSU, Michigan State University, and probably University of Minnesota. I can't speak for University of Minnesota, but Michigan State University strongly recommends that all wells be tested. There is a national water lab map hosted by the University of Vermont that can help you find a lab that does generic E. coli testing, which is a pretty good indicator for whether or not there's poop in your water. And that's the big thing, is making sure that the poop stays out of your water. And because poop is the big contaminant we're mostly worried about. We're sometimes worried about things like PFAS and lead, but most of the time we're worried about poop. That's the big thing. So that'll be a way to keep track of that. Someone put something in the chat. I want to make sure. Annalisa says we do have a map for Minnesota as well. So yeah. Cool. Yeah. So when you think about taking a water test, it's important to do some homework first. You want to make sure you ask some questions of the laboratory. First off, you need to make sure they're going to test for generic E. coli. And especially you want to make sure that they're not just going to give you a presence-absence sampling, because you really want to know how much is in there. Irrigation water can have a certain small amount of generic E. coli in there, because a lot of things happen. And if it's an irrigation well you're testing, you can have a couple of generic E. coli per 100 mils. You've just got to figure out what that is. I mean, obviously, if it's a home well that you're also using as an irrigation well, you don't want generic E. coli in there. You want no detectable generic E. coli. But if it's just an irrigation well, that enumeration is pretty important. The other thing that you really want to ask them is whether or not they do the lab work in-house or send it to another lab. Some of the smaller labs may not do the stuff in-house, and it may take them anywhere between 24 and 48 hours to actually get the test or the sample to a place where it gets tested. There is a 24-hour hold time. Once you deliver the sample to the lab has 24 hours in order for it to be considered appropriate. So in that case, you want to make sure that that they're testing in-house. The other thing too is to find out if they do test in-house, what day they test, because not every day the lab may not do generic E. coli testing, every day. So if you're dropping it off on Thursday and Tuesday is the day they do generic E. coli testing, you're gonna miss the window. And then what day do you run? And that's there. And then the last one is, are you equipped to test surface water? A lot of times, the labs themselves may or may not realize that what you're bringing them is something that could have potential contaminants in it. And if you're bringing them a Sandpoint well, there could be a high number of generic E. coli in that, so that they need to be prepared for enumeration that way. Sampling, I'm going to skip that. Just make sure you sample at a place that's representative of use. So for instance, if you are irrigating through sprinklers and you want to make sure that your entire system is not contaminating the sprinkler system, you want to go to the last emitter and take the sample. If you are sampling a water body like this, you want to go to where you're pulling the sample from that water body, so that you've got a pretty solid understanding of what it is you're actually getting. In general, the other thing to remember with the bottles, first off, get your bottles from the testing lab. They typically will give you the bottle. It will come like this. It will come sealed with plastic. It's important for you to keep that plastic on until you are ready to pull the sample, because the inside of that bottle is sanitary, and the stuff that we're testing for lives on us, lives in us, and it doesn't take anything for us to get that stuff from our bodies into the bottle. So we want to make sure not only that we've washed our hands before we take a water sample, but that we've also used hand sanitizer so that our hands are extra clean before we take the sample and before we open the bottle. We don't want to rinse the bottle beforehand, because we want to make sure that we aren't putting more stuff into that bottle and getting in an inappropriate or non-aseptic sample. As soon as we take the sample, we want to make sure we put it on ice so that it maintains its integrity. We are trying to measure stuff that is alive. Okay, we are trying to measure stuff that actively can grow and die. So the more we keep it chilled, the more representative we're going to be. It could warm up too much and then those critters could reproduce, or it could warm up too much and those critters could die, and then we don't have an accurate sample, an accurate accounting of what kind of bacteria are in that water. And here's my contact information, and I'm open for questions at this point.
Thank you, Phil.
Sorry I didn't leave a ton of time for questions.
Oh, no, you did. No, this is perfect. We have plenty of time. Yep, this goes until 10:15.
And I've got a Gene Simmons tongue to boot.
You do. A Gene Simmons tongue. I love it. We need this. We need this today, Phil. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions on that?
If RPC valves aren't for ag, what are they for? So that's a good question, Jackie. So if you have an RPZ valve, if you're, let's say there's water going in from the municipality into a condominium complex or an apartment complex, you'll often see RPZ valves going into that apartment complex so that the folks in the apartment complex don't foul, like, because any one of them could do anything to foul the water that goes back into the municipality's main line. Does that make sense? Okay, cool.
I know that in some parts of our state, the geography is and geology is such that folks are using driven wells. Has anybody on the call used driven wells, have questions about them, want to know how to use them safely? I mean, they're inexpensive. So, and sometimes it's, it's the only thing that'll work given geology, but also they're just really cheap. So I do see people using them, especially maybe at the beginning of their growing career. So wonder if people have questions on them, or Phil, if you just want to talk a little bit more about if people are going to use them, maybe how to do it more safely.
Just be aware when you're driving that well that you're pulling up water that is strongly influenced by surface water. So you really need to pay attention to the surface water sources that are surrounding the area that you pull the water from. If they get polluted, you might want to find a different source. Um, if if there's a situation where there's a lot of feces on the landscape and there's been a significant rain, those are some things that and I realize people are like, well, if it rains, I don't need to irrigate. But sometimes people pull up, sometimes there's rain events north. I mean, we live in the Midwest. There's spotty pop-up showers that happen everywhere. So the idea that there could be a lot of water upstream of an area that flows close to a sandpoint well is could happen. So you need to pay attention to that kind of stuff. Does that help?
Yeah, would you say that folks should test if they have sandpoint, should they test? We just talk about testing frequency in general.
Sure. In general, with wells, typically once a year is what people tend to do. Um, this is this is not this is sort of aligns with the legal requirements under the Food Safety Modernization Act, but in general, once a year is probably good. If nobody's telling you to test more often, once a year is probably good. If you're getting audited by a third party audit scheme, like a GAPS scheme, you're probably going to be required to test more often, typically a couple, 3 times a year, just so that if there's any kind of change in that water source, you're able to detect it. We have a colleague, Annalisa and I have a colleague that talks about testing being like trying to make a decision about when a train comes by standing on the railroad tracks. If you're only standing on the railroad tracks once a day, you can't really tell a whole lot about when the train's going to come. But the more often you test or the more often you stand on those railroad tracks, the more often you're going to get a better sense of when the train comes. That kind of gives you a sense that way.
Would you say that a sandpoint well should be considered surface water and be tested more than once a year?
I think that's safe. I think that's a safe way to proceed, especially if you're worried about the quality.
And then using that water just for irrigation, not for post-harvest, assuming that it is surface water. Even though
Correct.
we're pulling it from the ground, we have to act as though it's surface water.
I would. I think that's a safe assumption.
Right. Okay. But if we have groundwater that tests out at no detectable generic E. coli, we can use that in the field and also for washing our vegetables, washing our hands, all that.
Right. Cool.
Any other questions?
Yeah, one more in here. Is E. coli the only biologics that we should be concerned by?
That's a great question, Dylan. I think it really depends on where you're at. I've seen some people test for lead in their water, test for other sort of analytes like PFAS or nitrogen. From the standpoint of biological components, generic E. coli is an adequate indicator. So I guess it depends on if you're worried about other analytes, then test for them. If you're not worried about other analytes, in some cases there are state rules on, and I don't know what Minnesota's are in terms of testing water, that you need to test for nitrogen. So be aware that that's, that could potentially be in your water. And nitrates are an issue in large part because they can sort of mess with our bodies and mess with our water systems. So that's one of the things that we test for. In other parts, they also, like, for instance, I live near the Western Lake Erie Basin. So that huge algal bloom that happened in Lake Erie, our farmers were not the cause, but a part of the cause by their phosphorus amounts there's a soluble form of phosphorus. Typically phosphorus doesn't move, but in some cases it can solubilize and mineralize in certain ways to make it soluble. And that soluble phosphorus, we've been working to change the phosphorus that we use in our farms in that area in particular, so that way you don't have the phosphorus moving into the water source. Does that help? Okay, good.
Yeah, we do. I mean, a lot of folks have wells that are contaminated by nitrate, and there's a big push from our Department of Health for folks to test their well water for nitrates for human health. So continue to do that. But in terms of that, doesn't indicate fecal contamination. That indicates that you have a lot of nitrogen being applied to the fields around your well.
I'm wondering if the Department of Ag folks that are on the call, because I think there's at least one, if you guys offer any cost share at the state level for folks to test their water.
We have a produce safety program mini grant. I know Nicole is on right now. So they have a mini grant that's open right now. Nicole, if you're on, put the date that is due on in the chat. And it is for up to $800. And that $800 can be used to purchase materials for food safety and to pay for water testing. So in our, usually it's going to be $40 to $50 per sample for generic E. coli.
Right.
And Phil, I don't know if you ever see, but in Minnesota, I have heard some stories of folks going to water labs, the water lab saying, why are you just testing for generic E. coli? Why don't you test for pathogens? Why don't you test for salmonella? Why don't you test for 0157H7? And just let's go on record and say you do not need to test for those. You probably will not find them. So it will be a waste of your time and it will be very expensive. So if anyone's quoting you over then like $50, it's too much.
Yeah, that's what they call upselling where I come from.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, although some labs, even though they stick with E. coli, they randomly will just, it kind of depends on who you talk to. If you're hearing that it's $300 for a sample for basic generic E. coli, push back, say, can I talk to your manager? Is there an exception here? I'm a small farm. I'm doing the right thing. I'd like to continue to, patronize your business, but this is outrageous. It's
too much.
I understand the cost of things have risen, but sometimes I've heard of these crazy amounts because they don't quite understand that you're asking for something that's quite basic.
Right.
Do people have you had challenges with wells, working with well companies? Have you had contaminated wells that you had to shock, do other things with? I have worked with growers who have put stacked poultry litter really close to their wellhead. It has infiltrated down. And this is always a little surprising to me, Phil, like how, assuming this is a 200-foot well and I stack it on the surface and a month later I'm testing and I get a hit of generic E. coli. What does that mean to you about the well?
Well, that means to me that maybe there could be a lot of things going on. The first thing that could happen is you could have a situation where particularly in our area that has had a lot of limestone deposits over the course of millennia. So we have lots of limestone, and when we have acid rain percolate through that limestone, it starts to melt a little bit. So you could have little channels opening up in the limestone that allow surface water to move very quickly down into the water table. So that could be an issue that you have what's called karst topography, and that's what that is. When you have a limestone bedrock base and acid rain melting that limestone over maybe 100, 200 years, it'll open up those channels and those holes that pull water in quickly to the water table. That's one thing it could be. Another thing could be it's a bum well. You know, you've got a bum casing or a bum annular seal. So the annular seal breaks down, that bentonite can break down. Let's say the grouting is made up and maybe they didn't put clay in there. Maybe they just put sand in there. I've seen situations where people have done that, where if it's just sand, you got yourself a really nice quick conduit down the pipe to get down in there. So there's that. If the casing goes bad, a lot of times what can happen is there's a crack in the casing and then the water just goes right in the casing and there it is. So all those things can happen. One of the big issues that I've had a situation where I rolled over or hit a well with the back of my pickup truck, and that can break a casing really quickly. So it's important to think about how is that going to work. So be aware.
Thank you. All right, while people are coming up with another question, if you have it, Lauren, will you launch the post poll? Yeah, I would say one of the big takeaways is just to test your well, Phil. And sometimes I think people say, well, we drink with this water, you know, we have one well on our property. We don't
Right.
necessarily have multiple wells and we're drinking from it and we haven't been sickened. But would you
Right.
agree it's still a good idea?
Well, and you've got to remember, if you grew up drinking from a well, or if you yourself have been, you know, if this is your family well and you, as a kid, you grew up drinking the water, you've got all of those bugs in your system and all the immunity to those bugs in your system. The difference about the produce that we grow for other people is we don't know who we're selling that to. We don't know whether or not that the same things that keep us from or the getting sick, are they going to have that? If they're cancer patients or if they're young children, they don't have the immunity that a grown adult has. So grown adults can handle a certain amount of environmental insult, if you will, whereas we don't really have that option.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember. Any other questions?
So typically what I see Dylan's question in the chat about when should water tests be done. I would recommend that you do it in the beginning of the season, typically before you start to irrigate too much, and maybe just before you really start to harvest stuff. That would be an ideal time because typically when you get closer to harvest, that's when you have to have more. That's when you have to have safer water. So you want to know what your quality is then. Does that help?
We have a list of links that we will make sure people get when we send out a follow-up email to this session. We'll include a edited, recorded link to this session and then also a Google Doc that has links. Okay.
Cool.
Well, thank you, Phil. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for
Thank you.
helping Minnesota growers with this. This is really important for the Midwest.
Thank you. And anytime you want a Gene Simmons tongue, just come ask.
I hope your computer is okay.
It seems fine. I think we'll be okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Phil.
Take care, guys. It was good. It was good spending time with you all.
It was. Thanks.